It's really wonderful to be here. I haven't been back in this building in 11 years, and this is bringing back a lot of memories. I very, very much remember like sitting, I think I always used to pick like that seat right there in this lecture hall when I had classes back here. So yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So I wanted to just share a bit with you all today about, oh, these slides are skipping. Okay. About, a bit about my background and career journey and how I ended up where I am. Wanted to go into a specific case study on science policy and just explain a bit about what science policy is, because I know it's kind of a vague, confusing term, and offer some closing thoughts at the end. Very much welcome you all to stop me at any point and ask questions, so feel free to just jump in at any time. So at the very beginning, as was mentioned, I grew up here in Michigan, in Rochester Hills, just an hour away from here, and really liked engineering, I think, from the very beginning. I was on the robotics team in high school and loved just like being in the machine shop, getting to play around with things, getting to work on the robot, getting to really just do things with my hands. And that, I think, was really what brought me to the field of engineering, what got me excited about it. And I also, I think really my dream when I was young was to work for one of the big three car companies. I loved cars just growing up here. It was like so much of the culture just growing up in southeastern Michigan, and that was my dream job. And I remember when I came to University of Michigan, I think it was when I was a sophomore, I landed an internship at General Motors, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, I get to work for one of the car companies. This is amazing. And then, as you all may know, the 2008 financial crisis happened and they declared bankruptcy. So sadly, I never got to do that internship. Who knows, my life may have gone down a very different path if I had done that. But so that was a dream I had to retire at the time. But really enjoyed my time at University of Michigan on the solar car team, where I just loved, again, spending hours in the Wilson Center. I remember just how excited I was that we built this thing from the ground up. We started with nothing, and at the end of the day had created this solar car that we had put our hearts into, that we spent hours like laying down carbon fiber sheets on and sanding and painting, and got to then race. And that was really what just got me excited about this field and made me love this field. So when I was in undergraduate here, like the first few years, I think were really kind of tough for me. The class was really hard. As I was a junior and a senior, I got to take classes that I found more interesting and was really excited by that. And because of that, I wanted to go on to continue a PhD. I felt like my learning journey wasn't complete. I wanted to like dig in more and understand more about the field. And so that was my motivation for going into a PhD program. And so contrasting all that fun building machine shop, my PhD was a little different. My PhD was focused on modeling and simulations. And so this was my view for 6 years, was doing a lot of theoretical work on a computer. So my field was my research was in the field of metamaterials. And so in particular, I was focused on looking at how different polarizations of light interact with subwavelength particles. At the time, most of the literature was focused on linearly polarized light and explaining how that interaction works. And so, I was kind of looking at, well, what if it's radially polarized, or these other polarizations? What happens then? What can we figure out about that? And so that was the focus of my PhD thesis. Made some contributions to that field, but definitely was realizing along the way that these were just not the types of problems that was getting me excited to solve in the world. I wanted to focus my efforts on different things. And so during my graduate career was really kind of using that time to also figure out, okay, if this isn't what I'm going to do, because I thought research was what I wanted to do with my life, what do I want to do instead? And so really spend a lot of time trying to answer that question. But I do want to say that despite switching fields, there are a lot of really important lessons that I learned from EECS. So, some things I did struggle with, but like I said, the classes were really, really hard. They were very, very challenging. The curriculum here is so rigorous and intense. And I really struggled sometimes with the open-ended nature of engineering problems and research problems. You know, in your PhD, I was just given a problem, told to figure it out, and I couldn't Google it, right? That's the point of research, is you're coming up with new ideas. You're coming up with answers to questions where there are no answers. And that was really hard. And I also struggled with a lot of rejection, you know. I applied for various graduate programs, fellowships, submitted papers for publication, and there was a lot of rejection. So this was not an easy path. But I also, you know, want to say that a lot of these stumbling blocks were also learning opportunities. You know, the curriculum here was really, really hard, but it also taught me not to be afraid of tackling hard problems. And you know, the open-ended nature of research questions was difficult to wrap my brain around, but it also made me understand when I'm approaching something brand new, how to learn about that topic and how to tackle this open-ended problem and actually make progress on it. And rejection really taught me how not to be afraid of failures and just embrace them and understand that they're part of the process. And so while at the time, while I was going through my undergraduate career here and really, you know, facing a lot of struggles, I think in the end, they taught me some skills that were absolutely instrumental for being able to succeed later in my career. So as I mentioned, you know, I decided to go in a different direction after my PhD. And so immediately after getting my PhD in ECE from UC Santa Barbara, I did a one-year fellowship in the United States Congress. And so you will see, this is my fellowship cohort standing in front of the U.S. Capitol. This was in September 2017. I'm right there. Let's see if this laser pointer works. I am right here, circled in yellow. And I will just point out my partner who's sitting in the audience here, Levi, is also in this picture right there. This was really, you know, my entree into the world of policy, which I knew truthfully very little about prior to doing this fellowship. And so at the time, I saw this fellowship as, you know, a way to get my feet wet and understand more about policy. But I didn't really think of it as a career change at that point. I thought, you know, I'll give this a year and see what happens. And so, did you have a question? Yes, of course. Yeah.
How many of your cohort were women? I see they're all standing in the front row, but I'm guessing that.
You know, I don't know the exact number, but I do think that this fellowship program attracts a good number of women because I think, yeah, just people who are focused on wanting to make those larger scale impacts. So we're probably overrepresented beyond like what the STEM numbers would tell us, right? In this fellowship program. Yeah. And yeah, just to give you some more background. So this program, as you see on the slide, it's organized by this thing called the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's for people who have STEM PhDs who are interested in learning about the policy world. And so it's a one-year fellowship program, either in Congress or the executive branch, to just like immerse yourself in that world for a year. And so I did this program in Congress. And so I spent 1 year in the office of Senator Chris Coons for my fellowship year. And a couple of months into working for him, just completely fell in love with the work, and just, it was exactly the type of thing I wanted to do. You know, I just loved the impact we were being able to have. I loved the nature of the work where we were just talking to people, interacting with people on a very regular basis, just, you know, lots of things that really fit with my personality and the types of problems I wanted to solve. And so during that fellowship year, decided that, you know, I really want to try and get a job in Congress. I really want to try to do this after this fellowship year ends. And I think, like most things, it was a matter of luck and timing and hard work, where it worked out that I got hired into a job in the U.S. Congress. I worked on a committee called the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And so this committee works on policies related to a lot of the scientific agencies, NASA, NIST, others. And it was a very small but mighty team. And so we were, I think, 5 people at the time working on all of the Department of Energy's research programs, which for those of you who might be familiar with the Department of Energy and all the things they work on, it's everything from, solar energy to industrial emissions to the electric grid to electric grid cybersecurity, just like a whole range of things. So amongst the five of us, we covered all of that. And I mentioned, a couple specific things that I was working on in addition to DOE R&D. I was also working on policies related to manufacturing, technology transfer, commercialization, entrepreneurship programs, those types of things. So I spent about 3 years working on the committee under the leadership of Chairwoman Eddie Bernice-Johnson, whose picture you can see up there. And after that was appointed by President Biden to lead, to be the chief of staff at an office called the Office of Science at the Department of Energy. And so this is the basic science arm of the Department of Energy. It's a really big office. It's like, I think the budget is $7.5 billion. So it's huge, a huge organization. Does a lot of work with many of the DOE national labs. So some of you may be familiar with some of those. And this was during pandemic times. And so usually the swearing in when you accept this position happens in person, but I was one of those little squares on the Zoom screen, which was kind of wild for me to just log onto a Zoom and see President Biden as one of the squares up there. But so I spent about 10 months in that position where my focus was really on implementing his priorities, the president's priorities at the Office of Science. And so some of these topics are things you might guess, huge focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, things like environmental justice, in addition to just really, for me, understanding, how a federal agency functions, like a massive organization like that, how they function, how they do their work on a day-to-day basis, which I will say I thought I understood the agency well because I had worked with them in Congress for several years. I had no idea. When I was on the inside, it was just a completely different thing, and learned so much and have so much respect for the career staff who do this work day in and day out for decades of their careers. So yeah, so I spent about a year in that position and then transitioned to the organization where I am now, called the Bipartisan Policy Center. And so the Bipartisan Policy Center, we are a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And so we do policy research essentially. And there are different kinds of think tanks. There's many think tanks, but some of them I would say are more research oriented where, they're focused on really in-depth reports, very long reports, focused on original research, often even, publications and journals. The Bipartisan Policy Center, I would say, is more focused on, action oriented. We interact with Congress a lot. We interact with the executive branch a lot. So we draw a lot on original research and sort of translate those ideas into the policy world and work on getting them enacted. And so there's a huge focus on bipartisanship, as you might guess from the name, which, I personally feel is extremely important and is a lot of why I joined this organization. We are living through some really wild times where there's a lot of, polarization in the political sphere, but just also having grown up in Michigan where people have all sorts of, political affiliations, it was always really important to me that we, come together to advance ideas instead of focusing on our differences. And so there are three, main sort of flavors to our work. We focus a lot on influencing energy policies in Congress and the executive branch. We focus on convening. So we really try to bring the perspective of folks outside the government to the government. So that includes things like startups, communities, academic researchers, just really trying to break down those walls a bit. And we also develop new policy ideas that can be supported by both political parties. So we try to come up with the original ideas and advance those as well. And in particular, my focus is on something called energy innovation, which is really the set of policies that help go from idea to market. And so this includes things like support for commercialization, entrepreneurship, major energy projects. So when you first go from lab to real world conditions and funding and building that first energy project, as well as energy deployment, that whole range. So jumping along in the agenda, I'm going to transition now to talk a bit more about science policy and go into a particular case study that I worked on. So what is science policy? This is how I think about it. I think of science policy as the set of policies governing how science and technology is funded, conducted, supported, and advanced by government. And, you know, federal government has science policy, state and local governments have science policy that's kind of integrated in several parts of our society. And to give you a few examples of what that looks like, science policy is funding levels. So every year, Congress passes a funding bill to decide how much money all of the agencies are going to get to spend on research. And so that is science policy, deciding what those funding levels are and how they get allocated amongst all the different agencies, all the different programs amongst the agencies. Science policy is also fellowships. So some of you who are graduate students may know that there are, you know, for example, like NSF fellowships available that you can apply for to fund your graduate education. So administering those federal programs is also science policy, you know, deciding what to prioritize in those applications and that kind of thing. It's also prioritizing areas of investment. So some of you may know that Congress recently passed funding for this bill called the CHIPS and Science Act, where they dedicated $52 billion to microelectronics research, manufacturing, and workforce development. So huge investment from the federal government. That's also science policy, you know, kind of deciding like, what do we as a nation want to prioritize investment in for our science and technology future? And so to get even more specific, I wanted to go through a bit of a story about a particular science policy area that I contributed to in my career, which is the topic of industrial emissions. So essentially, I work on climate and energy policy, and historically there has been a lot of focus on reducing emissions from the power sector. So in this graph on the right, you can see how at the Department of Energy, how research spending was allocated in different sectors of the economy for emissions reductions. So this orange section is power sector, electricity, 56% of spending went there. In 2016, transportation was about a quarter, manufacturing was 7%, buildings another even smaller section of the pie. But then you see on the other side, well, how much of our emissions are actually coming from these different sectors, right? That's an important question to ask. Turns out that transportation is the highest emitting sector, electricity was close behind, and industry was also a very significant portion of this pie, right? And so this was a question that became very important for us to ask is like, well, what are we doing as a nation to address emissions from this sector? If our research dollars that we're spending on this problem right now are so small, like how are we going to make progress on this issue? And so that was a project that we undertook. And so this was our, guiding question: how can our nation reduce emissions in the manufacturing sector? And I'm going to go through basically the process that we followed to address that from a policy perspective. So the very first step, is research the problem. This is something where my PhD skills really, were put to use on learning about a topic I knew very little about. The types of organizations that we consulted for this were think tanks, staff at Department of Energy, policy research, really just trying to get a grasp on, where are we at? What are the existing federal programs right now doing on this issue? Really trying to just understand what the current state is. The next step was really to identify what policy solutions are available that are politically viable. So in the policy world, you have a set of tools in your tool belt, right? You can throw more money, research money at a problem. You can have tax, create some tax credits to incentivize the private sector to invest a problem. You can ask the federal agencies to collaborate more with each other to address a problem. You have the set of tools in your tool belt that are kind of generally understood. And so then it was a question of, well, which which tools does this policy problem need, and which of those are politically viable, which of those are actually going to have enough support to pass through Congress on a bipartisan basis. And so with that in mind, we developed a framework for the bill, incorporating all of this information. And so the bill was called the Clean Industrial Technology Act, and there were 4 key areas that this bill focused on. So the first one was research. We saw that there was definitely a need for more investment in research, as you saw from that pie chart earlier. And so the bill called for the establishment of a research, development, demonstration, commercialization program. So basically across that full life cycle from research all the way to commercialization, to invest in technologies that reduce emissions from industry and manufacturing by administering grants in that field. The bill also saw the need for more interactions with external entities related to this field. And so it established what's called a federal advisory committee, which essentially is a way for the federal government to get advice from external stakeholders like the private sector, NGOs, labor communities, to advise on what specific technologies this research program should focus on. Next, the bill required the development of a roadmap for industrial decarbonization. And so we really saw the need that we need a national strategy to sort of lay out how to tackle this problem. What do we focus on, in the next year, 1 year to 5 years? What do we need to focus on in the next 5 to 15 years? And how should we, sort of stage that? Where should we position ourselves as a nation? And finally, it established a program to assist in adoption of industrial decarbonization technologies in the private sector. And so we drafted this bill, put everything together, and then needed to get feedback from folks. So, we're a bunch of congressional staff reading a bunch of papers, we put together these ideas, but there are people who are going to be very affected by these programs, either because they are industry and, will be responsible for adopting these technologies, or know more about, what the labor and union implications are. And so then we got feedback from a whole range of stakeholders, some of which you see on this slide, but several others as well. For example, the Portland Cement Association, which you see mentioned there, cement is one of the highest emitting carbon sectors in our economy. So that was a very, very important group for us to get feedback on. So we went through a long process of hearing concerns from stakeholders, making changes to the bill, incorporating changes to get all of these folks on board and make sure that this is a program that's actually going to be result in achieving the goals that we want. And then we build bipartisan support for the bill and introduce the bill. So I was working as a professional staff member on the House Science Committee. So the lead on the bill that I was primarily working on was Representative Sean Casten here, who was a member of the committee. And on the Senate side, I had a colleague who was working on this bill for Senator Whitehouse, who you see pictured here. And as I said, typically in Congress, when you work to advance legislation, it needs to be bipartisan. And so we did a lot of work building support with Republicans across the aisle. And so that involved, yes.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
How do you, so do they come to you or do you go to them? And how do you target?
Great question. Yeah, typically, if you're leading on a bill, you go to them. And the way that you target people is really trying to understand, first of all, like what's the history of what they've worked on a particular issue? And second of all, what is important to their district or their state? Because members of Congress really, they're elected by people who in their district or state, it's extremely important to them to make decisions that benefit their constituents. And so, for example, like, is there a really influential company in their district that already is investing in just industrial decarbonization, where they want to, make choices and decisions that would benefit their constituents in that way. And so that might be an example of something that would help bring someone along with their idea. So you almost need to, yeah.
The two Republicans, both from West Virginia.
The two Republicans are both from West Virginia. Yeah, exactly. That was a bit of a lucky coincidence. There was no like brilliant insights or planning that led to that outcome. But yeah, I think it helped. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe Senator Capito agreed to sign on to the bill first. And for Representative McKinley, I think that it made the decision easier for him because he was like, oh, okay, you know, the senator is signing on to this. That means I probably can too. So yeah.
One of the 4 pieces is a roadmap that you presented. So this framework requires so who does the roadmap?
Yes, great question. The staff of the Department of Energy do the roadmap. And they actually came out with the roadmap a few months ago, I think. And so the staff developed that roadmap, but also in coordination with a lot of these external groups, you know, who will be affected by this policy. And so they do all that work to put that together. Yeah.
Some interesting questions. Who is a part of this team that you're working with? Like, are they also people like STEM PhD students or someone who knows how to write a bill or that's mostly like, how would you know how to write any of this?
Yeah, exactly. So there is a group of lawyers in Congress. They're called Legislative Council, and their job is to translate congressional staff's idea into legal language that achieves the goals of what you're trying to achieve. And so we work very closely with them where, you know, we have a general idea of what we want to do and go to them and say like, hey, we want a bill that does this, this, and this. And they'll be those translators into the legal text for us.
Yeah. So yeah, so your team is made up of STEM researchers, or is it diverse in any way? Like someone comes from policy or?
Yeah. So congressional staff, I think there's a lot of lawyers and people who have backgrounds in public policy. I think it's becoming more popular for people who have like STEM backgrounds to work in policy. And so the committee I worked on was actually very unique, where a lot of them were like former AAAS fellows and had STEM PhDs. So I'm trying to think, out of the 5 of us, I think 3 of us had that STEM PhD background.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Fun. Thanks.
Can you please clarify the connection between the bipartisan think tank you joined and then the Department of Energy, or just Congress as a whole, or is it a separate entity?
Yes, it's a separate entity. So
So you're not employed, so how do you get access to Congress?
so all of this work is work that I was doing when I was in Congress, when I was on the committee.
Okay,
Yeah.
I missed
So
that part.
but to answer your question, so our organization is a nonprofit organization. But we have kind of like 2 arms. So we have a nonprofit arm. We also have a lobbying arm where we hire people to go and, you know, talk about our ideas to congressional staff. And so that's how those connections are made. Yeah, but all of this so far is work I did when I was in Congress. So up until now, we have gotten to the point where we introduced the bill, okay, which I think this was about maybe a year or so of work to get to this point. Next, it's a long process. Next, we have to move the bill through Congress and through the committee process. And so first you hold a hearing on the bill. And so this is where you invite experts to come and testify on the bill. And so these can be academics, they can be think tank experts, they can be folks from private sector. Yeah.
Okay, so if we go back to the starting point. No, this is fine.
Yeah.
So you were on this committee. So who initiated this? As a member of that committee, can you come to committees and say, hey, people, I think this is an important problem to look at, or do you have a chairwoman, you know, you have a senator that you associate with. Does somebody come and say, I want this committee to look at X, Y, Z, or does the committee itself can say, let's look at what we want to do for this year and here's X, Y, Z?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it totally depends. It totally depends on the committee, on the senator, on the chairperson, whatever they want. And so in some cases, it will be, for example, when I was in Senator Coons' office, sometimes constituents would come up from Delaware and say like, hey, there is this small business tax provision that is really hurting my company. And, it's this weird loophole where like, we need to get this fixed in order for me to be able to like be successful. And so, in that case, the senator might say, oh, okay, that's important. I would like to work on that. And we would draft a bill to do that. But the senator also, was very open to ideas from his staff. And so we were able to propose ideas where we would say, hey, we think this is a really important gap that needs to be addressed. And, if he gave his sign off, then we could work on the issue. That was our dynamic on the committee. The chairwoman was really great about, empowering her staff to come up with new ideas. But it's also the case that committee members can come to the committee staff and say, hey, like, I really care about this issue. I would like you to write me a bill that, achieves X, Y, and Z. So it's all of the above. It's kind of, yeah, all of the above. Okay. So we introduced the bill and now focus on moving the bill through the committee process. So we hold a hearing on the bill where experts come and testify. They will sometimes even provide feedback on the bill and say, these sections are really great. These are what we need. Maybe this section needs to be refined in this way. And then we pass the bill out of committees. And what that means is essentially all the members of the committee vote on the bill, say, yes, we like it, no, we don't. You need a majority to pass the bill out of committee. And these are, like formal steps in the process to passing a bill. And so next, you focus on finding a vehicle for the bill to pass into law. So it's important to know that it's kind of rare for individual bills to pass Congress and pass into law all on their own. Congress is very, very busy. It might not always seem that way from the outside, but they're very busy. They have limited time to vote on bills. And so generally when they do vote on bills, they do it as a package, and we call that a vehicle. And so you will typically have a big package of a bunch of different bills that are all related in some way. And that is the thing that ends up like passing through the process, passing into law. For this particular bill, we were in a unique situation where there was this senator named Lisa Murkowski, who you see pictured there. And she was the chair for a very important committee on the Senate side called the Senate Energy Natural Resources Committee, which, as you might guess from the name, was in charge of all energy research policy on the Senate side. And she was in a situation where the chairperson kind of rotates on, they're only allowed to be in that position for a set amount of time. And so she was nearing the end of her time that she was going to be in that position, and was, because of that, very, very motivated to try and get something done. And so she did a phenomenal job, negotiating a package to make sure that she could get something passed before she, had to leave her leadership position. And so I worked with, when I was in the House of Representatives, worked with my counterparts on the Senate side, worked with Democrats, Republicans, who are all, we call it four corners, the House Democrats, the House Republicans, the Senate Democrats, and Senate Republicans, four corners, came to a four-corner agreement to agree on specific language that we were all happy with for this bill. And we got it into this package that was passed as part of a larger funding package, but it was called the Energy Act of 2020, and that passed into law in December 2020. So now the bill has passed into law, but that doesn't mean the work is done. There is this thing in Congress called authorization versus appropriations, when authorization essentially means a new program has been created, but appropriations means that you actually fund the program. So you can create a program, and if it's not funded, there is a chance that nothing will happen, and the agency may not necessarily do anything with it, right? So you have to follow through with actual funding to make sure that the program can get implemented. So the next step in this process was passing funding for the bill. And in this case, as I said, typically this would happen through the annual appropriations process. So Congress passes a funding bill every year. Typically, that's how a program like this would get funded. This was a particularly active Congress for in the climate and energy space. And so this particular bill received $500 million under the infrastructure bill that was passed last November for technology demonstrations, and an additional $5.8 billion for industrial emissions projects under the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this summer. And so this is, I would say, kind of like the life cycle of how you go from idea to funded program. But then the next step after this is the actual implementation of the bill. So this is an ongoing process. Now the Department of Energy has money to administer this program. And so now in my role at the Bipartisan Policy Center, I am assisting with, providing the agency with thoughts and feedback on how they can implement this bill in a way that is durable. So in a way that's going to, outlive political swings and will be robust and will follow through on the intent, as well as bipartisan. So ensuring that, things that they're doing are going to have support from both Republicans and Democrats. And so just to give you, a sense of the timeline, just for, steps 1 through 8, that was a 4-year process. Step 9, the implementation step, is going to take much, much longer, going to take several years. But just wanted to give you an idea, sort of like what does science policy look like? What's a example of how science policy actually plays out in real life. So with that, I just wanted to offer a couple closing thoughts for you all. So first of all, there's a lot of ways to get involved in science policy if that's something you're interested in. For folks, who are students in the audience, if this sounds interesting to you, you can join a clean energy startup or company and contribute your technical skills that way. You can also try out science policy through an internship or fellowship program like I did, but did want to advertise that my organization has a student intern program. So if it's a paid program, if you are interested, please let me know. I'd be happy to tell you more about it. For folks or professors in the room, if this is interesting to you, you can think about developing interdisciplinary research questions, applying your engineering focus to something that's more, that incorporates considerations of social science, which I know some of you are already doing, as I learned in conversations earlier today. You can also get involved in local politics if that's of interest to you. If there's if every time you are walking around your city, you notice that, man, there really aren't like recycling cans. And I have this, and I hate that I'm like throwing away my plastic bottle that I'm carrying around with me all the time. That's something that policy can influence and something that you can talk to your local government about to try and change. So, we are all affected by science policy in very real and tangible ways. And the amount of funding that we get every year for research is set by the government. And if that's something that bothers you, and if you think that we should be spending more funding on research, that is something that you can talk to your member of Congress about and try to advocate for. So all of that to say, science policy affects all of us in real ways, and there are many different ways that you can get involved if you'd like. So I am going to stop there. I'd love to take any questions.